Under this heavy sky, the spirit of man grew restless. In the shadows of the Forum, people turned to the mystery cults of Isis and Mithras, whispering for secret salvation. Philosophers spoke of stoic endurance, teaching us to bleed without crying out. But the world remained a hollow place, filled with the stench of disease, the grinding teeth of poverty, and a bone-deep yearning for a meaning the stone idols of Jupiter could never provide. Yet, in the east, a stubborn fire burned within the limestone walls of Judea. Here lived a people who refused to bow to the pantheon. We watched them cling to an ancient covenant, a singular promise of a God who spoke through burning bushes and parting seas. For 400 years, the prophets had been silent, but the expectation grew like a gathering storm. They waited for a deliverer to shatter the iron scepter of Rome, certain he would come with the thunder of 1,000 chariots. But the heavens were preparing a different answer, one that would not arrive with a sword, but with a cry in the dark. Long before the stone rolled into the tall grass, and ages before the multitudes pressed close to catch a glimpse of the healer, there was the silence. In the shadows of a Roman-occupied village, the Word through whom all things were made became a child, sheltered not by legions, but by the quiet courage of a peasant home. Observe the moment the veil between heaven and earth thinned to a terrifying translucence. A young woman named Mary stood in the blinding light of a messenger and uttered a yes that would fracture the history of the world. Beside her stood Joseph, a man of cedar and iron, whose strength was found in his stillness. He took the role of a father to a child not his own, a guardian who guided his family through the desert as refugees, fleeing the blood-soaked jealousy of King Herod. In the workshop of Nazareth, the creator of the stars learned the grain of wood and the weight of a hammer. He grew in the rhythms of an ordinary life, praying in the synagogue, studying the Torah, and once, at 12, startling the masters in Jerusalem by reminding those gathered that he must be in his Father's house. Yet he returned to the workbench. What secrets did the Son of God learn at the feet of a mortal man before the voice finally cried out in the wilderness? As the Master moved across the rugged face of Galilee, he did not seek the ivory towers of the learned or the gilded halls of the righteous. Instead, he walked toward the smell of salt and the stain of common toil. He stood upon the shoreline, calling to men like Simon Peter and Andrew, men with calloused hands and hearts as heavy as their waterlogged nets. They left those nets to rot in the sun, wet and tangled, to follow a voice they did not yet understand. Among them walked the impossible. Matthew, the tax collector, a man who had sold his soul to Rome for a handful of silver, sat at the same table as Simon the Zealot, who likely carried a blade beneath his cloak intended for men exactly like Matthew. It was a collection of fractured glass, violent, impulsive, and deeply flawed. They were not heroes of legend. They were a mirror of our own stumbling humanity. They argued over who would be greatest, their egos clashing even as they walked in the shadow of the infinite. They expected a Lion of Judah to tear the Roman eagle from its perch, yet he taught them to wash the feet of the weary. Slowly, agonizingly, the realization began to dawn. He was not a political savior, but something far more terrifying and beautiful. He was the living water, and they were merely the brittle jars of clay chosen to carry him. Yet even in that sacred circle, the shadow deepened. We see Judas Iscariot, the one who carried the bag, sitting at the table, his heart turning to stone, while the others dreamed of kingdoms. These 12, trembling with doubt and prone to failure, were the chosen foundation. How could these broken men hold a message that will shatter empires? The shadow of the Roman scepter had grown long, but in the deepening twilight of the Judean hills, a different kind of darkness was gathering. Witness him beneath the ancient, twisted olives of Gethsemane. There, the weight of the world's ancient debris seemed to press upon his very pores. The visceral agony of Gethsemane, where the spirit struggled against the flesh, in a sweat that felt like the crushing of the world's sins. The deliverer did not come with a sword. He came with a cup of sorrow, trembling as he accepted a destiny that no mortal could shoulder. Then came the flash of torches and the cold kiss of betrayal. The halls of power, religious and imperial, collided in a fever of fear. We see the mocking purple robe draped over lacerated skin, the hollow thud of the hammer, and the cruel laughter as a crown of thorns was pressed into the brow of the Most High. On the hill of the skull, the silence of the prophets reached its crescendo. As the sky turned to ink at midday, he uttered a dry, guttural cry that shook the foundations of the seen and unseen. It is finished. At that breath, the heavy veil of the temple, the curtain that separated the holy from the common, split from top to bottom. The barrier was gone. The heart of God was exposed. Joseph of Arimathea claimed the broken frame of the king, wrapping it in clean linen and laying it within a cave of cold stone. For 3 days, the world held its breath in the ultimate winter. Hope felt like a ghost, and the memory of his voice seemed like a fading dream against the reality of a sealed tomb. But the dawn that followed was not like any morning since the creation of light. The heavy stone, once an absolute seal of death, stood discarded in the tall grass. Inside the hollow of the earth, there was no decay, only a shroud, neatly folded, as if death had been nothing more than a garment cast aside upon waking. He was gone, yet he was everywhere. The risen one walked among the lilies, breathing peace into the lungs of the terrified. Death was undone, the ancient enemy shattered like glass beneath his feet. But as the cosmic awe settled into our bones, a haunting question remained. Death is undone, but what does an empty tomb mean for a world still in chains? 40 days after the stone rolled away, the Master ascended into the clouds, leaving behind a promise and a vacuum. 120 souls huddled in the silence of Jerusalem, waiting for a power they could not name. Then it came, not as a whisper, but as a violent, rushing wind that tore through the rafters. Tongues of fire descended, resting like burning crowns upon the heads of the humble. In that moment, the timid became titans. They stepped into the streets, their mouths filled with languages they had never learned: Parthian, Mede, Elamite, all hearing the wonders of God in their own mother tongue. 3,000 were baptized that day, their hearts pricked by the fire. This explosion of spirit marked a radical transition. What had been a Jewish sect, gathered in the upper rooms of the city, was suddenly becoming a Roman problem. The fire attracted the wind, and wind scattered the seed. The religious elite, terrified by this rising tide, looked for a victim. They found Stephen. As the stones thudded against his flesh, he saw the heavens open, and the seeds of the gospel were flung outward by the force of his sacrifice. Believers fled, carrying the word into every shadow of the empire, transforming from a Jerusalem community into a network that defied geography. Then came the transformation that would reshape history. Saul of Tarsus, the architect of fear, was leveled by a blinding light on the road to Damascus. The persecutor became the Apostle Paul. He became the bridge between worlds, writing letters that became the nervous system of a global body. From Ephesus to Rome, he stitched together a kingdom not of stone, but of hearts. Yet as the message spreads across the Roman roads, it must now survive the arena. As the message spilled out from Jerusalem, it hit the iron wall of Rome. It appeared as a contagion of love. To the empire, the Christians were atheists. They refused the incense to Caesar. They denied the pantheon that held the state together. They held a higher allegiance, and for that, the state demanded their breath. Consider Perpetua in the arena, a young mother. She did not look at the beasts with fear, but with a gaze that seemed to see into the very heavens. She guided the gladiator's trembling blade to her own throat, a bride welcoming her king. We hear the aged Polycarp as the wood was piled high around his feet. 86 years he had served his Christ, and he would not blaspheme the one who had never wronged him. The flames did not sound like a hollow end. They sounded like a refining fire. Across the empire, in the damp silence of the catacombs, a single oil lamp would burn against the dark. This was the secret, an underground network of compassion, burying the dead and feeding the orphan under the shadow of the sword. The lions could devour the flesh, but they could not touch the spirit. Can the empire kill a truth that is unafraid of death? The blood of the martyrs was the water that made the seeds grow. For 300 years, believers were a people of the shadows. Their litanies whispered in the cool damp of catacombs and the hidden corners of the marketplace. They were the fuel for Nero's torches and the sport of the Colosseum, a kingdom of the broken, defined by a refusal to bow to the eagles of Rome. But the wind of history was about to shift, turning from a gale of persecution to the heavy, gold-scented air of the palace. In the year 312, the world tilted on the edge of a sword. Constantine, a man of iron and ambition, marched toward the Milvian Bridge. There, beneath a sun that had seen 1,000 empires fall, he claimed to see a sign, a cross of light burning against the blue, inscribed with a promise. In this sign, conquer. He did not reach for a shepherd's staff. He reached for a paintbrush. We watch as the Chi-Rho, the monogram of our Lord, was emblazoned onto the shields of legionaries. The symbol of the executed became the herald of victory. With the Edict of Milan, the light was legalized. The prisons opened, and the incense of prayers rose freely. In the marble halls of Nicaea, the emperor himself sat among the bishops, his silk robes brushing against the scarred skin of those who had survived the torturers. Together, they hammered out the creed, declaring through the clashing of intellect that the Son was of the same substance as the Father. Yet, as the Church donned the imperial purple, the air grew thick. Prosperity carried a hidden price. When the cross becomes an ornament of the throne, does it lose the jagged edge of the truth? The shift was palpable. Priests becoming princes, and holiness becoming a ladder for power. In the distance, we see the first of the holy dissenters, the desert monks, fleeing the gilded cathedrals for the silence of the sands. They knew what we must now ask. Now that the Church has a throne, will it remember the manger? As the iron scepter of Rome splintered and the sun set upon the ancient world, the light faded from the cities. The marble temples crumbled, and the paved roads that once carried the legions were reclaimed by the wilderness. In this gathering gloom, when it seemed the memory of man might vanish into the smoke of barbarian fires, the Church became the bridge across the abyss. We remember Leo the Great, standing not with a sword, but with the terrifying weight of his office, walking out to meet Attila the Hun. He spoke a word that stayed the hand of the conqueror, proving that the spirit could bend the neck of the horseman when the empire's steel could not. Deep in the silence of the valleys, the lamp of the soul was kept burning by the steady rhythm of a new labor. Benedict of Nursia led the way into the stillness, where prayer became work and work became prayer. In stone-cold cells, hands gripped the quill, trembling as they copied the ancient words onto parchment. They were the librarians of a collapsing world, shielding the light of the word behind monastery walls while the storm raged outside. From this sacred isolation, Gregory the Great reached out to the ends of the earth, sending a message of hope into the mist of the far islands. They were a people protective of the truth, scholars of the spirit, building a foundation of faith that did not rely on emperors. Knowledge survived the night. But even as they triumphed over the dark, a shadow began to stretch between Rome and Constantinople. The garment remained whole for now, but the threads of unity were beginning to fray. For 1,000 years, the garment of the faith had remained seamless. From the marble corridors of Rome to the golden domes of Constantinople, one language of the soul was spoken. But beneath the surface, the earth was shifting. When we look at the Filioque controversy, it is easiest to see it as a family feud over the fine print of a legacy. The West added a few words to the creed, stating the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son, to clarify a theological point. But to the East, it felt like someone had rewritten the family's constitution without asking. It was a dispute over the source of divine power that eventually tore the household in two. In the year of our Lord 1054, the fracture became a wound. Cardinal Humbert strode into the Hagia Sophia, the air thick with incense and tension. He laid a decree of excommunication upon the high altar, shaking the dust from his feet. The East answered in kind. Two icons, once brotherly reflections of the divine, now faced away from one another across an ocean of silence. But silence soon turned to the roar of iron. The Seljuk Turks pressed against the gates of the East, and Jerusalem, the city of longing, fell under a different crescent. Pope Urban II cried out for a holy pilgrimage of steel. The cross was sewn onto the tunics of knights, a march for liberation that turned into a delirium of blood. In 1099, the streets of Jerusalem ran red, but the darkest hour was yet to come. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade diverted its fury not toward the infidel, but toward its own kin. Western brothers sacked Constantinople, stripping the altars and shattering the unity they claimed to defend. What remains of the gospel of peace in the hand of a knight? As the dust of the crusade settled, and the iron clamor of the sword grew faint, a new kind of fortress began to rise. Not of stone and battlements, but of logic and light. The birth of the great universities followed. Paris, Bologna, Oxford. These were the crucibles where the soul met the mind. And for a moment, the silence of the monk's cell was replaced by the fevered debate of the lecture hall. Scholars gathered, clutching vellum scrolls as they pursued knowledge, believing that to understand the stars, the music, and the laws of grammar was to peer into the very thoughts of the Creator. It was an era of faith-seeking understanding, a soaring synthesis where reason was not the enemy of the spirit, but its most sharpened instrument. Among them walked Thomas Aquinas, the silent ox, whose Summa Theologica sought to reconcile the ancient wisdom of Aristotle with the living fire of the gospel. He built a cathedral of the mind, brick by painstaking syllogism, teaching us that grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. Yet, even as the scholar's quill scratched out these divine harmonies, a tension began to pull at the hem of the church's robe. The mystic whispered of a God who could only be felt in the dark, while the scholar parsed him in the light. Reason had reached its peak, towering and magnificent, but beneath the arches of these new cathedrals, the scent of incense was beginning to mix with the heavy, metallic tang of gold. The institution was growing vast, wealthy, and dangerously ripe. The cathedrals of the late Middle Ages were not just stone. They were built on the terrifying geography of the afterlife. We see a world where the fear of God had been refined into a currency, a spiritual marketplace where the agony of purgatory was calculated in silver. The church, once a refuge for the broken, had become a titan of gold and bureaucracy. Men like Johann Tetzel marched through villages with a cynical rhyme and a heavy chest, claiming that as soon as a coin clinked in the basin, a soul took flight from the flames. But in the quiet cell of an Augustinian monk, a different fire was smoldering. Martin Luther, a man haunted by the crushing weight of his own unworthiness, found his release not in a coin, but in a dusty letter to the Romans. He saw it with a clarity that felt like a lightning strike. The just shall live by faith, not by gold, not by rituals, not by the permission of Rome. On a gray October morning in 1517, the silence of Wittenberg was shattered. Every strike of Luther's hammer against the door of the castle church was a tectonic shift. His 95 theses were not merely a debate. They were a declaration of war against the spiritual monopoly of the age. And as the gears of the new printing presses began to turn, his words were no longer trapped in Latin. They became ink and smoke, flying across borders in the common tongue of the people. The revolution had arrived. Sola fide, faith alone. Sola gratia, grace alone. Sola scriptura, the word alone. The iron grip of a single, unified West began to crack. The priesthood was no longer a guarded caste. It was the birthright of every believer. But the price of this freedom was a fragmented spirit. The sky was no longer governed by one sun. Suddenly, thousands of voices were claiming the truth, and the world would never be silent again. The thunder of Wittenberg did not leave the ancient walls of Rome unbowed. The church turned its gaze inward, standing before a mirror of its own making to confront the rot and the radiance alike. At the Council of Trent, the sanctuary was cleaned with the fire of resolve. We saw the selling of souls through indulgences cast out, replaced by a disciplined sharpening of the word. Tradition and scripture were forged together once more, a twin-edged sword meant to withstand the storm. Out of this crucible stepped Ignatius of Loyola, a soldier who traded steel for the spirit. His Jesuits became the vanguard, transforming the world into their cloister. They crossed terrifying oceans to the east, carrying the Eucharist to the shores of Japan and the heart of India. Simultaneously, the Baroque exploded in gold and shadow, a visual prayer in stone and oil, designed to overwhelm the senses and pull the trembling soul toward the divine. The Catholic heart was no longer merely defending, it was expanding, reaching for the edges of the map. But as the cross was planted in distant soils, a heavy shadow fell across the waves. The faith was now global, but it arrived on the ships of explorers. The world was changing. The old towers of dogma trembled as the Enlightenment dawned, bringing with it a cold, sharp light that sought to measure the soul with a compass and a rule. This was the age of the great architect, where God was relegated to the status of a distant watchmaker. In the streets of Paris, during the height of the Revolution, this shift manifested in stone and blood. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was famously stripped of its Christian identity and rechristened the Temple of Reason. An opera singer was crowned as the goddess of liberty upon its altar, heralding a world that believed the universe was a machine that required no divine hand to keep it turning. Yet, as the intellect grew frigid, the heart caught fire. Across the Atlantic and through the muddy lanes of England, a different wind began to howl. John Wesley stood in the open fields, his voice a hammer against the soot of the Industrial Revolution, calling for a holiness that burned in the bones. In the colonies, the first Great Awakening swept through the timbered churches like a lightning strike. Edwards and Whitefield spoke of a grace so raw and terrifying it broke the pride of the New World. Out of this spiritual upheaval, the American experiment was born, a radical separation of the scepter and the altar, where faith would no longer be a command of the state, but a cry of conscience. Can the Spirit survive in a world that believes only in what it can measure? The answer lay in the flame of revival. The 20th century arrived not with a song, but with the shriek of iron and the choke of mustard gas. The cross stood amidst the rubble of bombed-out cathedrals, a jagged silhouette against skies blackened by total war. In the trenches, faith was stripped of its gilded ornaments. It became a gasp for air, a desperate prayer in the mud. The Holocaust forced a confrontation with the mirror of shattering glass, demanding an answer to the silence of the heavens and the complicity of the earth. It became clear that a gospel that does not bleed with the suffering has no right to speak to the soul. Yet from the ashes of old empires, a wildfire ignited. In small rooms from Azusa Street to the farthest reaches of the global plains, the Spirit moved with a primitive Pentecostal roar. It was a faith of signs and wonders, bypassing the steeples of the elite to set the hearts of the forgotten ablaze. Rome, too, threw open its ancient windows at Vatican II, letting the breath of the modern world stir its incense-heavy halls. The word took to the streets in the hands of the oppressed. From the civil rights marches of the West to the liberation struggles of the South. It was no longer a religion of stones and decrees, but a living body, bruised and defiant. Even as the steeples of the North began to quiet, a new thunder was rising. The center of the faith was shifting, moving toward the sun-drenched horizons of the South. A map, stained with the ink of empires and the blood of witnesses, remains. But the story has outgrown the maps. The center of gravity has shifted. The cathedrals of the North stand hollow and echoing, while the heart of the faith beats with a new, fierce rhythm in the global South. In the favelas of Brazil, the bustling markets of Lagos, and the underground fellowships of Asia, the word is no longer a relic of the past. It is a fire for the present. The sanctuary changes form. It is no longer made solely of stone and stained glass, but of silicon and light. A digital sanctuary, where the gospel is whispered across borders through encrypted channels and flickering screens. Beneath the rush of technology and the noise of a fractured age, the heartbeat remains consistent. The faith still finds its home among the poor, the broken, and the silenced. It is the persistent whisper of Nazareth, refusing to be drowned out by the roar of the century. The story continues in the quietest corners of the modern world, where the ancient light of the Word is kept alive by the glow of a smartphone in a dark room, our modern-day catacombs.